My name is Marta Whitfield, and for 29 years I was the daughter my parents forgot to introduce. When I turned 18, my father wrote a check for $210,000 to send my younger brother to law school. When I asked for help with my own tuition, my mother patted my hand and said, "Sweetheart, degrees are for boys who need careers. You just need to find yourself a good husband." So I worked nights at a call center and mornings at a diner, and I put myself through college and then business school without a single dollar from either of them. 9 years later, I became the CFO of a logistics company worth $400 million. But at my brother's law firm partnership dinner last spring, my father stood in front of 200 guests and called Connor the only child in this family who ever made something of himself. He had no idea that the firm's newest major client, the one whose account had just saved Connor's partnership track, was a company I had personally built from the ground up. Before I tell you what happened next, take a second and hit that subscribe button, but only if stories like this one actually mean something to you. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from tonight. Now let me take you back to the beginning, back to a house where love came with conditions, and where I learned, far too young, exactly what I was worth in my father's eyes. I grew up in Fairhaven, Ohio, a town where the houses all had the same beige siding and the same clipped hedges, where everyone waved from their driveways and nobody asked what was actually happening behind closed doors. My father, Richard Whitfield, was a regional sales director for an industrial parts company, a man who measured every human being, including his own children, by return on investment. My mother, Diane, was a dental hygienist who had long ago traded her own opinions for the comfort of never disagreeing with him. In our house, there was an invisible ledger, and I was always somehow in the red. My brother Connor, 2 years younger, got new cleats every season. I wore my cousin's hand-me-downs. Connor got a car for his 16th birthday, a used Honda, but a car nonetheless. I got a bus pass and a lecture about how walking builds character. Nobody ever wrote these rules down. Nobody needed to. I learned them the way you learn where the creaky floorboards are, by stepping on them enough times to remember. My father wasn't a violent man, and he wasn't cruel in the way people picture cruelty in these stories. He didn't yell. He didn't have to. He had a way of looking past you that was worse than any shout, a way of continuing a conversation with someone else while you were mid-sentence, like your words had simply evaporated before they reached him. My mother filled the silence he left behind, not by disagreeing with him but by translating him into something softer. "Your father just wants what's practical for you," she'd say, smoothing the hair back from my forehead like that explained everything. Practical. That word followed me through my entire childhood like a shadow. I was a good student, the kind of good that should have been impossible to ignore. Straight A's from the time I understood what a grade was. I ran the debate team in high school and won 2 regional championships. I got into the National Honor Society as a sophomore, a year early. None of it mattered in the way I wanted it to matter. My father came to exactly one of my events in 4 years of high school, and he left before the awards were handed out because Connor had a scrimmage across town. My mother came to more of them, but she always sat in the back, like she was afraid of being seen supporting the wrong child too visibly. Connor, meanwhile, was average in almost every measurable way, and it never once cost him anything. He got a C in algebra and my father hired him a tutor within the week. He quit travel baseball halfway through a season and my father simply signed him up for a different, more expensive league the following year, no questions asked, no lecture about commitment. I watched this pattern play out for 18 years before I finally understood what it actually was. It wasn't that my father believed in Connor more. It was that Connor was, in my father's mind, the only child worth believing in at all. I was something else entirely. I was, in the language he never spoke aloud but lived every single day, an obligation that would eventually become someone else's problem. The dinner table that changed everything the night everything became undeniable. My mother made pot roast, the meal she only made for important announcements. I was 17, a senior, and I had just gotten my acceptance letter from a state university 2 hours away, along with a partial academic scholarship that covered most of my tuition. I only needed about $12,000 a year to make the rest work, which felt, in that moment, like the most reasonable request a daughter could ever make. I set the letter on the table next to my father's plate, my hands not quite steady. "I got in," I said. "With a scholarship. I just need help covering the difference." My father picked up the letter, glanced at the letterhead for maybe 2 seconds, and set it back down without reading a single word of it. He took a slow sip of his scotch, the way he did when he was about to deliver something he considered final. "That money's earmarked for Connor," he said. "He's going to need a real career eventually. A family to support. He looked at me then, really looked at me, which somehow made it worse, you just need to find yourself a good husband. Degrees are wasted on girls who are going to end up raising kids anyway." I looked at Connor. He was 15, hunched over his phone at the far end of the table, pretending with real commitment that he hadn't heard a single word of it. I looked at my mother. She was staring at her plate, rearranging pot roast she wasn't eating. Nobody said anything. Nobody defended me. The silence in that kitchen was the loudest sound I had ever heard in my life. I folded the acceptance letter back along its creases, slid it into my jacket pocket, and said the only thing I could manage without my voice breaking. "Okay." That was it. That was the entire negotiation for my future. That night I didn't cry into my pillow, and I didn't slam any doors. I sat at my desk with my laptop open until nearly 1 in the morning, applying to every job within walking distance of the campus I'd chosen. I applied to 4 positions before I finally went to sleep, and in the morning I applied to 3 more. Somewhere in that quiet, furious night, I made myself a promise. I would never ask my father for another dollar as long as I lived. I kept that promise for the next 11 years. For years of 5 hours of sleep, college became a blur of alarm clocks and burnt coffee. I worked 3 jobs simultaneously for most of it. Job 1 was the early shift at a campus coffee shop, 4 in the morning until 8, pulling espresso shots for professors before sprinting to my first class with milk foam still on my sleeve. Job 2 was a research assistant position in the economics department, which paid almost nothing but looked good on a resume and taught me how to build a spreadsheet model that could survive real scrutiny. Job 3 was freelance tutoring on weekends, high schoolers struggling with algebra and statistics, the exact kind of help my father had refused to buy for me when I was their age. I averaged just over 5 hours of sleep a night for 4 straight years. I didn't go home for most holidays, telling my mother I had extra shifts, which was almost always true, though it wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth was that I couldn't sit at that same table and watch Connor unwrap Christmas gifts that cost more than my entire semester's grocery budget. I wore the same winter coat for 3 years, a coat with a broken zipper I fixed myself with a safety pin more times than I could count. That coat got me through 3 Ohio winters and eventually across a graduation stage. I graduated magna cum laude with a degree in finance and a 3.91 GPA, ranked in the top 2% of my class. I mailed my parents an invitation to the ceremony 3 weeks in advance. My mother texted back 4 days before graduation. "So proud of you, honey. Connor has his bar exam prep course that weekend though, and your father promised to drive him. We'll celebrate properly when you're both home." I graduated with nobody in the audience who shared my last name. A professor I'd worked with for 2 semesters shook my hand afterward and told me I'd earned every bit of what was coming next. I cried in my car for exactly 6 minutes in the parking lot, and then I drove myself to a diner and ordered a slice of pie, alone, because I had decided a long time ago that I would never again wait for permission to celebrate my own life. Building something they never saw, I didn't go straight into an MBA program. I couldn't afford it yet, and I refused to take on debt I couldn't see a clear path out of. Instead, I took an entry-level financial analyst job at a mid-sized manufacturing firm, the kind of job nobody at a family dinner brags about. I worked there for 3 years, learning everything I could about supply chains and capital structure and how companies actually survive their worst quarters. I saved aggressively. I lived in a studio apartment with a mattress on the floor for the first year because I refused to finance furniture I didn't need yet. At 25, I finally applied to business school, got in with a partial fellowship, and financed the rest with loans I fully intended to pay off myself, which I eventually did. 2 years later, I graduated with my MBA and took a position at a logistics startup that, at the time, had 11 employees and a warehouse that leaked when it rained. Nobody in my family knew any of this. My mother knew I worked in finance somewhere. That was the entire extent of her curiosity, and I never volunteered more, because I had learned that offering information to people who had never asked felt like begging for attention. I refused to beg for any more. By 29, I was chief financial officer of that same company, which had grown, under leadership I helped build from the inside, into a $400 million logistics and freight operation with contracts across 11 states. I had a seat on the board. I had my name on press releases I never bothered showing anyone in my family. I wore a simple silver ring on my right hand, nothing flashy, engraved on the inside with the date I signed my first equity agreement with the company, the day I stopped being just an employee and became a genuine stakeholder in something I had built with my own 2 hands. I touched that ring most mornings before walking into board meetings. It was proof, quiet and entirely mine, of exactly what I had survived to get there. The phone call that pulled me back. It was a Tuesday evening when my phone lit up with my mother's name. She only called after 9 when she didn't want my father overhearing. "Marta, honey," she whispered, "I have news. Connor made partner at the firm. They're throwing him a big dinner." I set down the report I'd been reviewing and leaned back in my chair. "That's great, Mom. Tell him congratulations. It's going to be a real event," she continued. "The Wentworth Club downtown, 200 guests, all his colleagues and clients, and your father wants it to be memorable." I knew the Wentworth Club. Membership there started somewhere north of $30,000 a year. It was the kind of room where handshakes, closed deals and last names carried more weight than resumes. "Sounds like a big deal," I said, keeping my voice level. She hesitated in that particular way she always did right before delivering something she knew would hurt. "You can come if you'd like. But your father asked that nobody make a fuss about your job or anything like that. He just wants tonight to be about Connor. Don't outshine him. Don't complicate the narrative." That was the real message underneath her careful phrasing, the same message I'd been receiving in one form or another for nearly 3 decades. "Did he ask you to invite me, or did you decide to on your own?" I asked. Silence answered before she did. "It's easier this way," she finally said. "You know how he gets." I knew exactly how he got. I checked my calendar. No board meetings that weekend, no travel scheduled. Some part of me, the part that still remembered folding that acceptance letter into my jacket pocket at 17, needed to see this through to whatever ending was waiting for it. "I'll be there," I told her. The partnership dinner. I took a car service to the Wentworth Club rather than deal with valet attendants asking questions about my life I had no interest in answering that night. The club looked exactly like I expected: dark wood paneling, crystal chandeliers, a wall of windows overlooking a golf course that stretched out into the dark. Wealth practiced its particular kind of quiet performance in every corner of that room. At the entrance, a host checked a guest list twice and frowned. "I'm not seeing a Marta Whitfield on tonight's list." Of course they weren't. I called my mother, and she appeared moments later, flustered, ushering me inside with an apology that sounded more like an excuse. I'd worn a simple charcoal dress, nothing that would draw attention, the only accessory my silver ring. My father greeted arriving guests near the entrance with the practiced warmth of a man who had spent 30 years learning how to make strangers feel important. When he saw me, something flickered across his face for exactly half a second before settling back into cool politeness. He nodded once and turned back to the couple beside him. No hug. No greeting. Just acknowledgement, the way you'd acknowledge a coat check ticket. At 8 o'clock, the lights dimmed and a spotlight found the small stage at the front of the room. My father stepped up, champagne glass in hand. "Tonight," he began, his voice carrying easily across 200 quieted guests, "we celebrate my son Connor, the only child in this family who has ever truly made something of himself." The words landed like a physical blow, even though some deep, tired part of me had been expecting exactly this for years. Applause rippled through the room. Connor stood near the stage, beaming, shaking hands with people who likely knew nothing real about him at all. I set my glass down on a nearby table and turned toward the exit, and that's when a woman I didn't recognize stepped directly into my path. The woman who recognized me, she was maybe 40, sharply dressed, holding a glass of wine she hadn't touched. "Excuse me," she said, studying my face with an intensity that caught me off guard, "are you Marta Whitfield? The CFO?" My heart stuttered. "Yes," I said carefully. "That's me." Her face broke into something between relief and disbelief. "I'm Margaret Reyes. I run procurement for Halden Freight. Your company saved our entire West Coast operation last year when our previous logistics partner collapsed overnight. I've been trying to meet you in person for months." Before I could fully process that, Connor appeared beside us, his smile stiff with confusion. "Margaret, hey, what's going on? Do you two know each other?" Margaret looked at him, then back at me. "Wait," she said slowly. "You two are related?" "She's my sister," Connor said, in a tone that suggested the word cost him something. "Your sister runs Whitfield Logistics Finance Division," Margaret said. "Connor, this is the woman whose company is your firm's newest and most significant client. Half of your partnership dinner tonight exists because of the account she personally closed with us 6 months ago." Connor's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: confusion, panic, and finally a forced smile that didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. That's a coincidence," he said quickly, reaching for Margaret's elbow. "There are some people from the firm I want you to meet." "Connor," Margaret said, not moving, "why didn't you ever mention your sister was the CFO of one of your firm's biggest clients? That seems like something you'd bring up." He didn't have an answer ready. I watched him search for one and come up empty, and in that silence I saw the first genuine crack in an evening built entirely on carefully managed appearances. The truth finds its own way out. Guests nearby had started to notice the tension, heads turning, conversations quieting into curious murmurs. My father materialized beside us with the particular instinct he'd always had for sensing disruptions to his carefully staged events. "Is there a problem here?" His voice was low and controlled, but I could see the muscle working in his jaw. "No problem," Connor said quickly. "Marta was just leaving." "I wasn't," I said calmly. Margaret looked between the three of us, clearly beginning to understand there was an entire history here she'd stumbled into. "Mr. Whitfield," she said, "did you know your daughter's company is the reason Connor's partnership case looked as strong as it did this year? The Halden account is the single largest new client the firm brought in this cycle." My father's expression didn't change much, but something behind his eyes did. "We're aware Marta has a career," he said smoothly. "Tonight isn't about her, though. Tonight is about Connor's accomplishment." His accomplishment. Built, in no small part, on a contract I had personally signed, sitting across a conference table from partners at his own firm 8 months earlier, none of whom had ever bothered connecting my last name to his. A man nearby, someone I vaguely recognized as one of my father's golf partners, leaned in. "Richard, I didn't realize you had a daughter in finance. You've never mentioned her." My father's smile tightened at the edges. "We're a private family, George. Marta's always preferred her own path." Private. The word did a lot of quiet work covering 30 years of erasure. I felt the old, familiar urge rising in my chest, the instinct to shrink myself smaller, to smooth things over the way I'd watched my mother do my entire childhood. Instead, I took a breath, steadied it the way I did before walking into any high-stakes negotiation, and made a decision I'd been circling for years without quite landing on it. I was done making myself smaller so other people could feel bigger. "Standing my ground, I'm not leaving, Dad," I said. He blinked, genuinely startled. "Excuse me?" "I came to celebrate Connor's partnership. I'm going to stay, have a drink, and congratulate him properly. That's what family does, isn't it?" His jaw tightened, and for a moment I thought he might actually argue with me in front of 200 witnesses, but he simply turned and walked back toward the stage without another word. I watched him go, and instead of the satisfaction I might have expected, I felt something closer to exhaustion. I ordered a sparkling water at the bar and stood near the window, watching the party continue around me, the practiced laughter, the handshakes, the elaborate performance of people pretending everything was exactly as it appeared. Margaret found me there a few minutes later. "I owe you an apology," she said. "I had no idea I was walking into something so complicated." "You didn't do anything wrong," I told her. "You just told the truth." That's apparently a rare occurrence in this particular family. She studied me for a moment. "For what it's worth, everyone at Halden thinks incredibly highly of you. I've heard your name in board meetings I wasn't even sure you knew about." I thanked her, and I meant it, more than she probably realized. It was a strange kind of validation, hearing my own worth described back to me by a stranger, in a room full of people who had spent 30 years pretending I didn't have any at all. My mother's confession. My mother found me near the coat check 20 minutes before I finally decided to leave. "Marta, honey, please," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, gripping my arm. "Don't make this into something bigger than it needs to be. Not tonight." "I haven't done anything, Mom. I'm just standing here. You know what I mean." She glanced over her shoulder toward my father. "He's already upset. Connor's had a hard enough week." "Do you even know what I do for a living, Mom?" I asked, and something in my voice must have carried more weight than I intended, because she actually flinched. "I know you work in finance," she said. "I know you're successful. I'm the CFO of a $400 million company. I closed the exact deal that made Connor's partnership case this year. Did you know that?" Her eyes dropped to the floor, and she didn't answer, which was its own kind of answer. "Why have you never once asked me a real question about my career, Mom?" "Not once, in 9 years. I didn't think you wanted to talk about it," she said quietly. "You always seemed like you wanted to keep it separate from us." "I kept it separate," I said, "because every single time I tried to share something with this family, it got measured, weighed, and found less important than whatever Connor happened to be doing that week. I stopped sharing because sharing never once made a difference." She had no response for that, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel the need to fill the silence for her. Connor's unraveling later that night, after most of the formal toasts had ended, Connor found me near the terrace doors, his tie loosened, a drink in his hand he'd clearly had one too many of already. "You couldn't just let me have tonight, could you?" he said, his voice tight with something between embarrassment and anger. "I didn't do anything, Connor." Margaret recognized me. "That's not something I orchestrated. You never even told me you worked with Halden. Do you know how that makes me look? Like I didn't even know my own sister's job?" "Maybe," I said, keeping my voice level, "if you'd ever once asked me a real question about my life in the last decade, you would have known. I'm not the one who's spent 9 years introducing me as someone who works in an office downtown whenever people ask." He didn't have a response to that either. "Dad paid $210,000 for your law degree," I continued, quieter now. "I paid for every single one of mine myself, working 3 jobs at a time, sleeping 5 hours a night for 4 years straight. And tonight he stood on that stage and called you the only child who ever made something of himself. Do you understand how that feels, even once, let alone for 30 years? Connor looked at me for a long moment, something shifting behind his expression that might have been the beginning of actual understanding, or might have just been the alcohol. "I didn't know it was that bad," he finally said. "You never asked," I told him, and I meant it as the truest thing I'd said all night. The conversation with my father I found my father alone on the terrace near the end of the evening, staring out at the darkened golf course, his own champagne glass long since empty. "You made a scene tonight," he said without turning around. "I didn't make anything, Dad. I stood in a room and existed. That's apparently enough to count as a scene in this family." He turned to face me then, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, he actually looked at me, really looked, the way he used to look at Connor's report cards. "You've done well for yourself," he said, and the words sounded almost foreign coming out of his mouth, like a language he'd never bothered practicing. I said simply. No help from you. I did what I thought was right at the time, he said. I thought I was protecting you from a hard path. You didn't protect me from anything, Dad. You just made the path harder and called it protection. There's a difference. He didn't argue with that, which surprised me more than anything else that entire evening. Margaret says your company is the reason half this dinner even happened, he said finally. It is. I didn't know that. You never asked, I said, echoing the same 3 words I'd told Connor an hour earlier, because apparently that was the actual theme of my entire relationship with this family. He was quiet for a long moment, and then he said something I genuinely never expected to hear. I'm sorry, Marta. It wasn't a full apology, and it didn't undo 30 years in a single sentence, but it was more than he had ever offered me before, and I let myself accept it for exactly what it was worth, nothing more and nothing less. What changed, and what didn't? A lot happened in the weeks that followed. Connor called me 2 days later, sober and clearly still processing the entire evening. We talked for almost 2 hours, longer than we'd talked in years combined. He apologized, not perfectly, but genuinely, and he asked me real questions about my work for the first time in his adult life. We're not close now, not in some cinematic, fully healed way, but we talk more than we used to, and that counts for something. My mother started asking about my career too, small questions at first, tentative ones, like she was relearning a language she'd let herself forget. I answer them, because I've decided that punishing her forever for 30 years of silence doesn't actually give me back anything I lost. My father and I are still figuring out what our relationship looks like. He's texted a handful of times since that night, careful, measured messages that never quite reach the apology I might have wanted from him but never demanded. I respond when I feel like responding. I don't when I don't. That's a boundary I earned the hard way, and I intend to keep it. The company relationship with his firm continues, professionally, the way any business relationship does, and there's something almost darkly funny about the fact that my career and his son's career are now permanently, contractually intertwined, whether either of them likes it or not. The lesson here's what I learned across those 30 years, distilled down into something I actually believe now instead of something I was just surviving through. You cannot force people to see your worth on your timeline. I spent over a decade of my life quietly hoping that one more promotion, one more milestone, one more accomplishment would finally be the thing that made my father look at me the way he looked at Connor. It never was, and eventually I understood that it was never going to be, not because I hadn't achieved enough, but because his ability to see me clearly was never actually about what I had or hadn't done. Some people carry a version of worth in their heads that was handed down to them long before you were born, and no amount of your own excellence will rewrite it. That's not a reflection of your value. It's a reflection of their limitations. The real turning point in my life wasn't the night at the Wentworth Club, even though that's the night this story probably lives or dies on for you. The real turning point happened years earlier, alone in my childhood bedroom at 17, when I decided I would build a life so solid, so entirely my own, that I would never again need anyone's permission to believe in it. That decision, quiet and completely unwitnessed, mattered more than any spotlight moment ever could. If you're watching this and you recognize any piece of yourself in my story, the overlooked child, the one whose success never seemed to register, the one who had to build everything from nothing while someone else got handed the blueprint, I want you to hear this clearly. You are not required to wait for someone else's recognition to know your own value. Build the life anyway. Earn the ring, the title, the seat at the table, for yourself, because you decided you deserved it, not because you're still waiting for someone to finally notice. If this story meant something to you tonight, do me a favor and leave a comment below. Tell me if you've ever been the overlooked one in your own family, the child whose success somehow never counted as much as it should have. I read every single comment, and I promise you, you are far from alone in this. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next story, and if you want more like this one, check the description below for more from Clam Stories Time. Thank you for staying with me through this one. Take care of yourselves, and remember, you don't need anyone's permission to become exactly who you're meant to be.